let's go ahead and go to the next slide. This is a helpful image here. Really what you want to take away is that people with eating disorders and meeting that criteria certainly are experiencing disordered eating, but not everybody experiencing disordered eating is going to fit the criteria for an eating disorder. You might be wondering, what are these abnormal eating practices? Just off the top of my head, some might include skipping meals, restricting, binging, purging, excessive use of diuretics like coffee and hunger suppressants, excessive use of laxatives, and then also medications for weight loss, and it would also include restricting through exercise as well. So here's our helpful image, and we can go ahead to the next part. So we're going to look at 5 case studies together, and now we're all going to put on your thinking hats and kind of be curious about these case studies. There are 5 clients that are imaginary. I pull a little piece from lived experience with my clients. These case studies may or may not be experiencing an eating disorder or disordered eating. Go ahead and next one. May I have a volunteer to read case 1?
Esther, age 20, is a collegiate athlete. In the middle of her season, she started experiencing dizziness and fatigue during practice. She also experiences painful cramping and bloating, but notes she has not had a period in 2 months. Esther reported this to her doctor, and they are concerned she may have an eating disorder. She strongly denies this, noting she eats breakfast, lunch, dinner, and an evening snack every day.
Thank you. Any clarification questions so far? Any concerns that pop out to you?
Well, the dizziness and fatigue.
Certainly a concern.
What is that?
Right.
I think we'd want to know like what she considers breakfast, lunch, dinner, like what food
That's an
intake.
excellent question,
Yeah.
right? Like, what does that mean? Is that a full plate of food, or is that a banana, right? And that can make a big difference.
Yeah.
So we're going to go over the symptoms really quick. So given her symptoms of dizziness, fatigue, the painful cramping, bloating, and then she's also missed her period, and that's a big one too. And all of those combined, likely what's happening is that Esther's just not getting enough food daily, especially as a collegiate athlete. So let's go ahead to the next slide here. Big takeaway here, our case analysis for case 1 and Esther, is to remember that food is fuel, food is energy. It seems like low-hanging fruit, but if we don't get enough energy through food, our organ systems are really gonna start suffering, especially if it's repetitive behavior. And Esther's probably been in her season for a few months now, probably not getting enough daily. So for her organ systems to perform at their best, she's gotta hit, I just made up this number, 2,200 calories per day. She thinks she's doing that by eating her breakfast, lunch, dinner, and evening snack, but she's not considering potentially this big chunk that she's going to be using up through exercise. So her daily net's probably a lot lower. And if we look at the tank here, she's probably only getting about half of what she needs daily. Therefore, her organ systems are kind of suffering, especially the brain. The brain is a big one where we see these psychological and physiological crossovers. So that dizziness and the fatigue, and then the bloating and cramping is probably your digestive tract maybe kind of being atrophied. So the period is also a big one too, and that's a big indicator of restriction. And let's go to the next case. Anybody feel like reading case 2?
I will.
Go ahead.
Case 2. Mary, 31, has struggled with her body image all her life. Her doctors referred to her growth chart and consistently classified her as overweight. After trying various diets over the years, Mary sought the advice of AI, which suggested a keto diet, low carb, high fat. Over the last 6 months of keto, Mary's weight decreased quickly until it plateaued. She has also experienced irritability and disinterest in her hobbies. Friends have noticed her isolating more, citing rigid routines around meals. Mary's doctor is pleased with her weight loss and suggests seeing a therapist for her depression.
Any clarification questions or initial reactions?
Deb and I yesterday went to a session on relapse and addiction. And honestly, I mean, it's kind of interesting to me, these symptoms she has, irritability, disinterest, isolating, are also things you would look for relapse, but totally different substance, right?
I
But
think
it's
that's
just interesting.
It's a huge thing to point out that
Yeah.
there's so much crossover with diagnoses as well, and we're just
Yeah.
grouping symptoms, and essentially, if you fit this grouping of symptoms, then you get this diagnosis. But we're learning it's a lot more complicated, and the doctor is probably well-meaning here in seeing that like these symptoms are taking place, but is maybe missing a big piece of this. Right, and jumping to, oh, I see depressive symptoms. This is probably depression. She could be experiencing depression, but likely there's probably some disordered eating going on here as well. And review of her symptoms, let's see, she's had body image struggles all her life, and probably there's some stress around there. She is doing a pretty restrictive diet, and then she's had rapid weight loss, and then disinterest in her hobbies, irritability, all of these psychological symptoms, rigidness in routines, and then maybe some depressive symptoms as well. So go ahead and go to the next slide. With these symptoms, likely what's happening is that, again, Mary's probably not getting enough nutrients, but the important part here is that she's probably not getting an adequate balance of our macronutrients, which are carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. And with our hierarchy of nutritional needs here, our building blocks are really those big macronutrients. If we're missing those, our organ systems are suffering. So with her eating, low carb, high fat, she's not getting enough carbohydrates daily, would be my guess. And her brain is certainly suffering because the brain really, really needs carbohydrates because they're basically the energy powerhouse. Variety in individual nutrients, she's probably skimping on some micronutrients as well, those vitamins and minerals, but really where she's suffering are not getting enough macronutrients. Another thing I want to bring up here with this case is the doctor may be missing some eating disorder symptoms based on how Mary appears and her history and her growth chart. And so it's common to have this myth here, and people believe that only people who physically appear underweight and or sickly can be diagnosed with an eating disorder. And we know that's just not true. Anybody in any body can have an eating disorder or experience disordered eating. So that may have been a factor in why Mary's doctor was thinking that it was only depression based on those symptoms. Anybody want to read case 3?
I can.
Please.
Matthew, 14, has always been a picky eater. Growing up, he refused to eat most meats, legumes, vegetables, and fruits. Matthew primarily sticks to eating buttered noodles, cereal, French fries, string cheese, and applesauce. Matthew's parents struggled to get him to try other foods. Matthew's father once persuaded him to try grilled chicken. He reluctantly chewed and swallowed a small piece. Matthew complained the chicken was stuck in his throat, and panic symptoms ensued. Matthew also refused to go to restaurants with unfamiliar foods and overwhelming smells. I have a coworker whose son is autistic, and the noodles, cereal, French fries, string cheese, and applesauce, because they're the same color, he's into color. So when I read that, I went, oh my God!
Yes,
That's like,
yes.
that's what he survives on. And Doritos.
Right, I'm
The
glad you brought that up.
Same color of food. It all
Mhm.
has to be the same color food. But chicken nuggets he will eat. But it's not like
Yes.
this. But I'm off topic.
No,
but
that was
that's-
super helpful. I appreciate you bringing that up because that is a huge part of probably what this client is experiencing is sensory overwhelm,
Mhm.
right? So there are certain safe foods for Matthew, and he sticks to those. Reviewing our symptoms really quick here, certainly selective, restrictive intake of food. There are safe foods and probably unsafe foods. Another piece of this too is that this complaining of the chicken being stuck in his throat, it seems like there is some panic and fear around choking. And then our other piece here is another sensory overwhelm piece with unfamiliar foods and overwhelming smells. Let's go ahead and take a look at the next slide. So most likely with these collection of symptoms, Matthew could be experiencing ARFID, avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. And I appreciate the example that you brought up because it's super common with people who fall under the neurodivergent spectrum. So that includes autism, ADHD, dyslexia, a bunch of neurodivergent symptoms. But the sensory piece of it is a really big part of this. So this used to be called selective eating disorder. It's really about avoiding specific foods, having safe foods and then having unsafe foods. And it's due more to sensory discomfort of eating or of eating a certain grouping of foods. And then there also can be anxiety over consequences of eating. So some people can have panic over maybe a fear of vomiting after eating because maybe they had a really traumatic experience in the past of vomiting after eating, and that becomes a trigger for them. Matthew probably has a fear of choking, but it falls under that umbrella. Let's see what else I want to highlight here. It often has a negative impact on physical health, growth, and well-being. With our last cases we saw, if we don't get enough energy, our organ systems and our growth is going to be affected, especially if this is a 14-year-old kid. We want to make sure that he's getting, like in our hierarchy of nutritional needs, adequacy and balance. And an interesting part about ARFID, it's not usually related to body image. It's more about the sensory piece and fears around certain foods.
So not all of those have to be present.
Not all of these need to be present. And that will be a similar answer for most questions. It can be different for everybody.
Okay.
Good question.
Would this be mainly in childhood, or would people develop this?
I think we often see it present in childhood,
Yeah.
but it can be somebody's lifelong experience, certainly.
I worked at the hospital and we had a clinic
Mhm.
for children, who were, some were preemies or whatever, and so
Mhm.
they just grew up with, all the way along, couldn't be fed,
Right.
had feeding tubes,
Right.
graduated,
Oh.
and just,
And I would be curious if those kids would also fall under avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. They very well could. And there may not be a sensory piece for them. It just may be, it could be related to anxiety and a traumatic experience and, growing up in and out of hospitals and experience with an eating tube. It's really different for everybody. But I appreciate the questions and the example.
I have a
Yes, please.
situation I'll share. Like as an adult, I had a Cinnabon in an airport before getting on a plane and having to wait for a long time to take off because of fog. And I get stressed in those claustrophobic, tightly packed in situations. And so I threw up before the plane took off. So anyway, so I do
Is there
not
fear?
feel like Cinnabon is a...
They're not crossing paths.
Right.
Yeah. It's like, it doesn't trigger like desire me, but it also doesn't make me run the other way. But I'm like, no thanks to the Cinnabon.
Right.
So I think it's like a continuum, right? It's like,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Thanks
So
for bringing that up.
Yeah.
And the relationship to trauma and all of these symptoms and triggers we will get to, and I think it'll make this a lot more clear as we go along.
I think anytime you've eaten something and thrown up for any reason,
You stay
Yeah.
away from
you
it.
You're a little suspect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Those
True.
things in
Not
my
even that,
background.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a good point.
I'm remembering, this probably is not very related, as a child, eating all the peas, all the carrots.
Mhm. I've seen that as well, as potentially if food is really pressured on people and they're really refusing it, maybe they've had ARFID, but their parents are well-meaning and trying to get them to eat a variety of foods, that can kind of create this feedback loop of, I'm afraid of this food, it's a really unpleasant experience and distressing experience to be forced to eat it. And that can create that feedback loop. All right, let's move on to case 4. Anybody feel like reading case 4?
Sure. Joseph, age 50, is very mindful of his health. Every weekday, Joseph wakes up at 5:30 a.m. to get a full workout in before work. Joseph follows an intermittent fasting routine, allowing himself to drink only coffee or water before the gym. After, he typically skips breakfast, waiting to eat until lunch. Joseph recently had labs drawn, and his doctor said, quote, "Everything looks great." Joseph has noticed he sometimes gets headaches midday. He struggles to concentrate on tasks and keep track of appointments. Joseph decides that he will aim to go to bed earlier and drink more water throughout the day.
Any clarification questions or initial
Wonder
reactions?
when those labs were drawn.
That's a great
Afternoon?
question. That's a great question.
Probably after fasting, the way he was eating.
Mhm. Which can certainly affect how labs show up. And that'll be an interesting part of this one. So let's review our symptoms that he's experiencing. There's certainly some skipping of meals going on through fasting. And we're also seeing headaches, and then lack of concentration, maybe some brain fog, and lapses in memory. And then Joseph's conclusion is, maybe I'm dehydrated, or maybe I'm just not getting enough sleep. So let's go ahead and take a look at
He
our
is getting up at
analysis.
5:30.
He is probably not getting enough sleep. That could be a piece of it. Okay, so we've got our little, potentially how Joseph is eating, right? There's a big portion of this happening that's fasting. And you gotta remember too that we go to sleep and we fast for 8 hours.
Yeah.
And Joseph might be fasting for an additional, 4 to 6 hours. It's a big portion of time fasting. And I want to zoom in on this myth with Joseph's case, because he's skipping meals. He's probably ignoring his natural hunger cues that are coming up and telling him to eat breakfast. So our myth is you can trick your body into not feeling hungry. But the fact is, hunger is a fundamental biological need. Ignoring your hunger cues can lead to skewed hunger cues, metabolic disruptions, and physiological distress. And what I mean by skewed hunger cues is most people, if they're feeding their body with enough energy every day, their hunger cues are pretty regular. So you get hungry for breakfast, you get hungry for lunch, you get hungry for dinner, and snacks in between. And it's pretty regular. If you start skipping around and not feeding your body, your hunger cues get kind of wonky. And you might wake up at 3 a.m. with a hunger cue. And they take a while to get back to normal. The more we honor our hunger cues, the more they'll get back to normal. So I want to point out our hunger scale here. I think Joseph is really well-intentioned. He really wants to be healthy. He wants his labs to look good, and they are showing maybe everything looks great. Labs are not a great tool all the time for judging if somebody's experiencing disordered eating or eating disorders. Oftentimes, there has to be a lot of symptoms for a long period of time for labs to get skewed and to show that. And then you also brought up too, what time of the day are labs getting drawn? Was he fasting for the labs like most people do? But could affect what those labs show. So our hunger scale here, big takeaway is that our green numbers here, the hunger and fullness 4 through 7, that's where you want to start eating and comfortably stop eating. So some people sometimes will wait until their stomach is really loudly growling. But we can see on this scale, that actually might be kind of a more dangerous space in hunger. Yellow is certainly take caution, make sure you're getting food. The orange and the red are, this is kind of dangerous. We don't want to wait to eat until that point, and we don't want to stop eating at that point. That can also be really dangerous. So if Joseph is skipping meals, he's probably ignoring a lot of these symptoms and maybe even waits until he's like in this zone to get his lunch.
I have a sister-in-law, and she eats it, not just at mealtime, but she always says, I'm so hangry. And ooh, when you're around her, go eat.
Yeah.
And then go eat is like, it's really interesting how she is.
It's interesting
Yeah,
how
she just,
quickly that can
she
set in.
knows it,
Oh yeah.
and you can tell it.
I wonder why she's not honoring her hunger cues when she
don't
is
know.
initially
I think she's
hungry.
busy. She's
That very well could be it.
busy and not time to eat at that
Mhm.
point, but boy, she gets, you don't want to be around her very much when she's like that.
Yeah. Makes sense.
Mhm.
Especially with all the other cases that we've seen in these like physiological and psychological crossover symptoms.
Mhm.
Let's go ahead and do our last case. Anybody want to read case 5?
I'll do it. Rebecca, 44, had a neglectful childhood. She refers to herself as a latchkey kid and remembers spending a lot of time alone. She recalls pouring herself countless bowls of cereal as she watched TV by herself. Presently, Rebecca is struggling after a recent breakup and increasing pressure at work. There are days when she finds herself impulsively stopping at convenience stores to grab snacks on the drive home. Sometimes she eats until she feels painfully full. Rebecca feels overwhelming guilt and shame after these episodes and typically skips lunch and the next day until the cycle repeats.
Thank you. Any clarifying questions or initial reactions?
Well, she was denied the proper food and stuff that she needed, and
Absolutely. And that's going to be a big
In the
piece of
beginning.
this case.
and by herself.
Food and detention.
Yeah.
like you
Yeah,
said, by
right.
herself.
Right.
Plus, she has some big stressors in her life.
Mhm. Yeah, I hear people talk about stress eating.
Right. And that's going to be a big piece of this. Go ahead.
Guilt and shame around it just feeds that cycle.
Right, right. We're definitely seeing a cycle, a feedback loop. And like y'all just pointed out, these symptoms that are concerning the trauma from childhood, most certainly, current stressors, and then probably binge eating and past fullness is what's happening here. And the guilt and shame is a really big piece of this as well.
It's also hard to find healthy snacks at the
Mhm.
convenience store.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So,
And that might link to what we're going to talk about in this next slide. So we're going to take a look with Rebecca's case, comparing physical and emotional hunger. This is a quick, certainly not maybe complex as it fully is, but a quick kind of look at the difference between the two. And we can refer to our hunger and fullness scale that we saw, our hierarchy of needs, to kind of look at physical hunger here. And we've learned the onset's pretty gradual, develops over time, right? We get these different levels of cues. Compared to emotional hunger, which Rebecca could very well be experiencing, is more sudden and more urgent. So maybe if she's coming home from a really hard day at work, having a lot of stress, she's getting kind of an emotional trigger to eat, or maybe to eat like specific comfort foods. Where physical hunger is felt, like our hunger and fullness scale, we see some stomach emptiness, low energy. Where it's felt with emotional hunger, it's going to be more related to distress and or boredom. Food choice, usually a variety with physical hunger. Food choice with emotional hunger, like we mentioned, it could be cravings for specific foods. And maybe that's why the convenience store comes in play here, where foods are maybe higher in sugar or in salt, and those kind of hit specific cravings.
Oh, so she kind of wanted those.
Yeah.
As opposed to.
Exactly. And satisfaction, with satisfying our hunger, brings relief and satisfaction. We get hormones to tell us that we're feeling full. Satisfaction with emotional hunger, eating is serving a temporary feeling of relief in this case, but it's probably not going to resolve the emotional needs or the emotional distress that's happening. And we'll talk more about that in the next few slides. And you see your signs here too that we've already kind of covered. So let's go ahead and transition here. So we mentioned a lot of symptoms of disordered eating and eating disorders in our cases. Here are some more symptoms of disordered eating, but what I really want y'all to take away is there are so many symptoms and they have a lot of crossover with other diagnoses as well. And so there's a lot of physiological, there's a lot of psychological. The physiological often affect which psychological symptoms are showing up and vice versa. And it's really easy to misdiagnose an eating disorder for another illness or for another mental health concern. Go ahead to the next slide. So you might be asking at this point, why does this even happen? We're going to take a look at biological, psychological, and social factors. Again, eating disorders and disordered eating are super complicated. This is not an exhaustive list, but ones I want to highlight. Looking at biological, there may be a hereditary marker for eating disorders. We don't know the grouping of genes necessarily. Epigenetics might play a role, which means that people in chronic stress might have genes turned on or turned off, so that also might affect things. Neurodivergence, we saw that with our ARFID case, that there's some crossover with neurodivergence, maybe sensory issues. There's also some crossover too with rigidity and neurodivergence. To have an eating disorder or to complete disordered eating, one has to be fairly controlled, and the relationship to control has to be pretty significant. So that could play a role. Illness, thinking of chronic illness, maybe cancer treatment, autoimmune diseases, just being ill in general can affect our eating schedule and what we can eat, what we can't eat, and that could develop into an eating disorder later on. Medication can play a role here.
I thought it said meditation.
Well, that might be one of the treatments. Medication sometimes suppresses hunger cues. I'm thinking of like ADHD medication specifically. A lot of my clients struggle to remember to eat because they don't feel hungry because their medication suppresses it. Life stage changes, that could be age, different stressors in your life. Also could include pregnancy and breastfeeding. I mean, those are really significant changes to one's metabolic state. And there have been some cases that people I've worked with that are accidentally restricting through breastfeeding because it just takes up a lot of energy and you're feeding your baby. So you have to increase the amount of nutrition that you're intaking. Psychological. So as we mentioned before, some personality traits. If somebody's like more type A, has a different relationship to rigidity, they're more likely to gravitate towards eating disorder as a coping mechanism. Coping skills here, kind of what we just talked about. How does one cope with distress? How does one move through distress? Do they use overthinking and rumination? Do they use avoidance? Do they use distraction like video games? Is there an addiction involved here? Those all can go hand in hand with developing an eating disorder. Trauma also goes hand in hand with that, emotional distress, and we'll get more into why trauma is a big factor here. Low self-worth, so internalizing negative beliefs about self and who somebody is, and it can be more than just like body image and external beliefs about self. It's more in the subconscious brain. These like really deeply held beliefs about self can affect this. Distorted body image, you might have heard of body dysmorphia, and that's when somebody's looking in the mirror and they see their reflection and their brain alters how they appear. That can be a big piece of this as well. And then co-occurring mental health diagnoses, obsessive compulsive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, and substance use. I see a lot of comorbidity with those diagnoses and eating disorders. Moving on to our social factor, we've got family norms and rules. What I mean by this is what foods were labeled as healthy and unhealthy in your home. Were there certain rules around when you could have certain foods? And then how were bodies and food talked about in homes? Learned self-talk kind of goes along with that, and it goes along with our low self-worth. Emotional literacy, what I mean by that is how does somebody process their emotions? Are they bottling it all up? Are they processing their emotions with the coping skill of eating and essentially like eating your emotions? Diet culture is a broad term. What I mean by that is culture's value of thinness and how we see that play out in all sorts of areas. So in branding and marketing, diets, and trying to encourage thinness among people, you can see it in movies and in TV characters. You can see it in the fashion industry. It's kind of pretty insidious, honestly, in our culture that highlights dieting and really values thinness. Social media goes hand in hand with that. I have a lot of teen clients who are scrolling TikTok and they're like, oh, I follow this gym influencer or this Pilates influencer and she's eating X, Y, and Z. And then they show me it sometimes and I'm like, she's eating a rice cake for breakfast. Like, this is probably not the person that we want to, take dietetic information from. And likely those influencers could be experiencing disordered eating themselves. So that plays a big piece of this as well. Social pressures, what your peer group believes, what your romantic partner believes and says about bodies and food. Goes hand in hand with bullying, being commented on for your body or what you're eating. Sports-induced malnutrition, we saw that with our first case where there was a lot of exercise and not enough replenishment. And so that's happening with restriction. And then SES malnutrition, and what I mean by that is food scarcity through poverty. I'm gonna pause here for a second. Any questions with any of that? Okay, let's move on. So I am also a trauma therapist. So I really want to highlight the connection between eating disorders and trauma. I'm going to try not to be super wordy with this, but trauma is complicated, so I'm going to do my best to give you guys a very brief explanation. Some of you might be familiar with fight or flight or freeze. Heard those terms before? Okay, excellent. So what you need to know is there is a part of the brain that is the subconscious area of the brain. It's called the limbic system, basically an alarm system that is always scanning the room for threats in order to keep people alive. It's a survival mechanism. And that alarm system will send people into fight or flight or into freeze. This was super helpful when we were cavemen and had a lot of dangers and we needed to fight or flight and freeze our way out of situations. But now this can go off when we're giving a presentation, right? Or maybe our partner says something to us and that hits a trigger and we go into those fight or flight or freeze states. So trauma, and what I mean by trauma is the experience of having these triggers of fight or flight, can develop anytime a person is stuck in fight or flight or freeze for a prolonged period of time. So we can see it with our infographic here. We really like to spend a lot of time in our social engagement window. That's when we're in this rest and digest state. Our ventral vagal nervous system is turned on and we are feeling good, present, engaged with others. We don't love being in fight or flight or freeze. It's really it's really uncomfortable and comes with a lot of symptoms that are really uncomfortable. And we're not meant to spend a lot of time in either of these states, but sometimes we get stuck there. So trauma can develop anytime one is there for a prolonged period of time, which is kind of a different definition of trauma than you might be aware of. In our society, I think we kind of rank trauma as like, how bad was it? What happened to you? Did you survive a hurricane? Like these really horrible, probably traumatic events. Well, we're really wanting to expand our definition of trauma, and any time that you're stuck in fight or flight or freeze, you can have trauma from that situation. And trauma, one piece of this to remember is trauma takes the charge of fight or flight or freeze, the overwhelming emotions, all the icky feelings of it, and it kind of like freezes it along with that memory in a certain part of the trauma brain. It doesn't go through regular memory processing. And so that's why trauma is really intrusive for a lot of people. It comes with these triggers. It's connected to our alarm system here. Anytime we come across a similar enough trigger, this whole system can go off. So eating disorders stem from a maladaptive way of coping with traumatic distress. What I mean by this is your frontal lobe, your conscious brain, it's not getting a lot of blood or nerve signaling when fight or flight is in full activation or freeze. So all of the energy in your brain is going to this big survival mechanism. But your conscious brain really doesn't like to be there, and it wants to get out of it. And so sometimes it tries to think its way through getting out of it. And it tries to problem solve, but it's not working very well. So sometimes it comes up with some maladaptive ways of trying to make the state of fight or flight more tolerable. And it's really well intentioned. It's trying really hard, the dysregulated brain, to solve the problem. But likely what's happening is you're probably just being stuck further in fight or flight or freeze, and it's temporarily providing some relief. That was a lot. Any questions about any of that information?
Do you find that's even more true in a very analytical type brain or personality?
Certainly could be. I mean, nobody's safe from this experiencing, right? Like, we all have this part of our brain. The solving the problem part, yes. If we I have a lot of clients who are very analytical, and especially during emotional processing. They have a really hard time being in their body and feeling their emotions, and they just really want to solve the problem and think their way out of it. But that's not very effective, as we can see, and can kind of lead to potentially people developing more trauma and more triggers. So in our next slide, actually.
Can I say before we leave here, I'm reading a novel about a woman whose husband is abusive.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, it's surprising. He doesn't even have to be home. And she's still in that red part where she's like
Totally.
watching to see if he's home yet. Or anyway, it's just like, it's not even only when you're in contact with the traumatic person or event, but like, you're worried that it might show up or happen again, or
Right.
So it's been surprising to me.
And I would label that as hypervigilance,
Yeah.
which is that alarm system's always scanning for threats.
Yeah.
And if it consistently is hitting threats, it's probably going to be more hypervigilant. That alarm system too doesn't connect well with our logical brain, that frontal lobe. So it's going to have a lot of false positives. Like, say this person hears a squeak of tires,
Yeah.
and they're like, "Oh my God, my husband's coming
Yeah.
home," but it could just be the neighbor.
Yeah.
And it's going to go into fight or flight.
Yeah.
Here's an example of how trauma creates this feedback loop. So with eating disorders, say somebody hits a trigger. Let's think of our client Matthew, who felt like he was choking. He had that experience with the grilled chicken. It didn't quite go down right. Okay, he probably hit a trigger there. Then he's going to go into fight or flight. And he's probably going to use maladaptive coping skills because his brain's trying to solve the problem, get him out of fight or flight. Potentially could cause some temporary relief or numbing of fight or flight, but it's not actually going to flip a switch of getting him out of that nervous system. We really need to flip the switch and get back to our social engagement window. And that's for another presentation on how you do that. But the point here is he's probably going to spend a prolonged time in fight or flight, which then is probably going to develop trauma, which is going to lead to new triggers, and that's how you get this feedback loop of increasing and more severe eating disorder symptoms. And this is not a feedback loop that is just applicable to eating disorders, but really any trauma and coping mechanisms. And there's our simplified version there. Let me go to the next slide. Any questions on trauma and eating disorders before I move on? So we're getting to the part of how do we apply all this information? How to support a loved one with an eating disorder. First and foremost, learning about eating disorders with a trauma-conscious lens. And we just kind of did that. And what I mean by that is learn as much as you can about eating disorders and disordered eating and all the complex factors that go into developing it. And know that there's this feedback loop with trauma that's continuing these behaviors that we're seeing. The stuff that we're not seeing is probably the physiological and psychological stuff that's going on internally. Next, pretty low-hanging fruit, but we really want to empathize with their struggle and accept that you may not fully understand. I see this a lot with family members who have somebody in their family who is struggling with an eating disorder. They have a really hard time understanding what's going on and why these triggers are happening and why this disordered eating thoughts are coming up for this, because they maybe haven't experienced it themselves. And that's valid, but it's complicated and it's hard to understand. But you don't have to fully get it to empathize with somebody going through something that's really challenging. And sometimes just being with somebody and saying, I really see how hard this is for you, and I can see like how stressful this is. What can I do to help you kind of move through this? Can go a long way. Same with helping them tolerate distress while resisting the urge to make eating disorder behaviors go away. So I often see this with parents who are really frustrated. Valid to be frustrated. It's confusing. It probably disrupts meals. It probably makes things hard sometimes. However, if a parent's nervous system is getting dysregulated, right, and maybe they're having a trigger by seeing their kid do this behavior, they might opt to yelling or bargaining or using shame or something that's not necessarily helpful for helping their kid move through this nervous system distress that they're experiencing in that moment. So helping kids regulate and move through the distress is a better tactic than trying to say like, hey, you can't have those behaviors anymore. Offer accommodations when necessary. That's really broad. Maybe that means that parents are plating for their kids and they're making sure they're getting enough nutrients. That's a very broad one. Helping them seek professional support. So, like I said, I'm a therapist. Anybody who's just experiencing an eating disorder should probably have an eating disorder treatment-aligned therapist, as well as a dietitian who knows eating disorders, and then also a PCP that knows eating disorders as well. And go to the next one. Okay, so let's zoom in on some common phrases you might hear from somebody with an eating disorder and how we might respond. So if somebody with an eating disorder is saying, oh, I feel so fat, really what we're gonna wanna approach it with is empathy and gently redirect. That's gonna be the same for most of these, right? It's seeing somebody how they are feeling without affirming what they are saying. So, I'm sorry you're feeling this way, your feelings are valid. I wonder what else might be going on for you. Can we talk about what might be so scary about your body changing? And that's the gentle redirect, right? Another one, I don't deserve to eat. In response, we're leading with empathy. You always deserve to eat and nourish your body. Consuming foods is a basic human need, and you have the right to take care of yourself. That's the gentle redirect. I hate my body, and somebody might respond with, I'm so sorry you feel that way. Your body's so much more than how it looks. It works to support you all day, every day. And how would it feel to talk about things that bring you joy? Empathy and redirect. And somebody might say, I'm really afraid of gaining weight. Gaining weight can be scary. It's part of getting healthy. How can I support you in feeling safer and more comfortable during this process? Redirect. There's no perfect way to do this. Just meeting somebody with kind of giving them a feeling of like, okay, I see you. I see that you're struggling. I'm not going to affirm what this negative, maybe disorder thought is saying, but I'm going to gently redirect you to feel heard, feel seen, and then maybe think about it in a broader perspective. Next slide. Perfect. Okay, so now directly relating to our presentation today, and specifically zooming in on communal spaces, just want to highlight a few bullet points of how we can make spaces more inclusive for people with eating disorders or those that are experiencing disordered eating. So first thing to remember, eating disorders are deeper than vanity, and with our case studies, we kind of learned that, right? There are body image concerns, often wrapped in them, but it's a lot deeper and a lot more complex. Remember, eating disorders do not discriminate. Eating disorder, disordered eating can affect anybody in any body from any background. Same thing with our third bullet point there. It can affect anyone in any body and in any body size. Supplying furniture options for all body sizes can be a really important piece so that everybody feels comfortable has a place to sit, has a place to be in the community. Eating disorders can affect physical and cognitive ability, so accommodations have to be made available. I'm thinking about having access to wheelchair ramps, to elevators, maybe if somebody's experiencing some brain fog and difficulty concentrating, maybe we can make some accommodations there if somebody's going through that process. This piece here, no body comments and helping others set those communal boundaries. What I mean by body comments is really any comment, even well-meaning, about someone's body. So you might hear commonly somebody say like, oh my gosh, you look so good, have you lost weight? Probably just don't even want to say that. It's just not necessary. It's not inclusive. You don't know what that person is going through. So any comments on bodies, probably just not necessary. Something I might swap that with is like, oh my goodness, you look so bright and cheery. I love seeing your smile. That's pretty body neutral. But body comments, probably just a no-go. Probably it goes along with food comments as well, and commenting on what somebody's choosing to eat or not eat. And then if we're providing food in these spaces, we just want to have an inclusive variety of choices. Thinking of our ARFID case, right? We want to have inclusivity. And then our other cases to make sure that we are hitting those adequacy pieces and the variety and balance. And our next slide, I think, is questions.
Let's make sure that our online
Okay,
folks,
see if I can
I know we didn't have.
get their faces back on here. Is that our last slide, the question slide?
That's our last slide.
Yeah, okay. So,
Who's Mara?
oh, and I'm going to stop the share then. And I'm going to remove that. Oh. Okay, we see your faces again, Zoomers. Would anyone like to ask a question?
Yeah.
Mara?
Are eating disorders becoming more prevalent among young women? I'm hearing from friends and acquaintances about people in their families that are having difficulty, and I just wondered if it's becoming more prevalent. Is social media perhaps feeding the eating disorders?
That is a great question. I don't have the statistics to back that up, but in my personal work, there's certainly always a wait list for people who are needing eating disorder therapists. We have consistent client intake, so I would say yes, it's probably trending upwards. I do think that's another complex answer. I think social media certainly does play a part in this, especially with my, teens who are just scrolling through and they're like, oh, I want to have this chiseled body or Pilates body or whatever they point to, and they're going with that person's workouts and what that person is eating in the day. But we all have nutritional needs that are different, and likely, this is what I tell them, likely if somebody is posting obsessively about their body and food, their brain could potentially be in a disordered space because they're obsessively thinking about it, and that's what happens when we're in a restriction state. So that can be a very big piece of this. I think another piece of this discussion might be around access to certain GLP-1s and how that's affecting thinness, especially. I'm thinking about like the red carpet and seeing celebrities just looking thinner and thinner and thinner. And their access to those medications is probably fairly easy with their income, and I don't think they probably need to be prescribed it in order to take it. So that's me making an assumption. But there is also a subgroup of people who are using GLP-1s irresponsibly, and GLP-1s repress people's hunger. It's shutting down people's hunger cues. And they can be really helpful for some people and then misprescribed for other people. And if you don't have a dietitian or a doctor working with you, you can fall into the subcategory of people who are experiencing anorexia, basically. So that's a multifaceted question. Thank you for bringing it to our attention.
So people can obtain these drugs even without a prescription?
I think if you have the means to do so, you certainly can.
And I see Jean Bush-Bacelas also has a question.
Hi there. This is very interesting, by the way. I listened in the car all the way home, and so it was very useful. I wondered how, if you have someone that you're friends with or have a relationship with, how do you help them find help? I'm sure not just every therapist can really help with eating disorders. How would you advise helping that person if they've indicated that they want help?
Good question. I don't know of necessarily any specific website that would have a list of like eating disorder aligned therapists in Ann Arbor, and you can filter it that way. Usually I direct people to, if they're looking for a therapist, Psychology Today, and filter specifically for eating disorders, and then whatever insurance, if they want to pay through insurance as well. The U of M's adolescent, I don't remember what it's called. Their adolescent wing has a specific treatment of eating disorders, and they do a really good job of providing a list of therapists. So they might have some information on their website, but that really is kind of a need that we don't really have a system for quite yet. There's certainly a lot of therapists who want to work with eating disorders but don't necessarily have the background, and they're really well-meaning, but I would always encourage somebody to work with a therapist who has some background specifically in eating disorders.
Would family doctors be able to?
They also might be a good referral source as well. Yeah. It's a good question.
Noticed one of the, in the list of ways you can support folks, you didn't mention give good advice.
I think there's certainly always some room for good advice, and then there's certainly some room for, just listening, right?
Yeah, I'm thinking more of turning it around. This is for your own good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And with our like trauma feedback loop, we might see how that's just not always very effective. That's right. You can't, with eating disorders being really wrapped into trauma and psychological distress and also physiological distress that affects brain functioning. And this reminds me of, I'll have clients that are really early in their eating disorder recovery phases. So maybe this is a really common occurrence, like my teens especially will end up in the ER with really low heart rate. And parents don't know that these disordered behaviors are going on. They're probably happening in secret sometimes, but they go to the ER and then they're like, oh, you have an eating disorder. Like, you're not eating enough. And that's when they find out that this is what's happening. They didn't know maybe they were being restricting. Maybe they're an athlete who doesn't know she's restricting. It can vary with each case, but then they go usually through this program of like, okay, we need your parents to be in charge of all your meals. You got to be eating this amount of calories. Like, we need to get you through a process of refeeding so that your body goes back to the safe zone and your heart isn't totally atrophied. So my point is there that they're still experiencing probably some psychological symptoms that are not going to be cleared for a few months. So my clients might be showing up with some lack of concentration, some brain fog. The information that I give them sometimes is not really getting absorbed. So if I'm giving them a bunch of advice, hey, you should do this, you should do that, the buy-in, as far as like, will I follow that, is probably pretty low. And the psychological adherence to that is also probably pretty low. And so that's where meeting them where they're at really comes into play. And that's why they need a treatment team often that's like, hey, you got to do this. And that's usually the dietitian's and the doctor's job. Thankfully, I don't usually have to say, hey, you got to do this in this schedule. But I'm the person who is helping them cope with the distress for the most part and understand kind of what's going on. Good question.
My grandson was over Mother's Day, and he's into athletic gym sports.
Gotcha.
I still can't think of what I'm trying to say exactly, but
Parallel
bars and rings and stuff.
Gymnastics.
Gymnastics.
Oh, okay.
As well as now that he's kind of gotten beyond that, he goes to the gym and very regularly. I was thinking when you said that, I'm so glad he probably got a really good instructor in gymnast, because he was telling me how many macros he has to have in protein and whatever. And so, I mean, it's all chicken probably, or fake protein, or you know, put in protein, but because, I mean, he grew up on hot dogs, and finally he found chicken, so, but I was just so glad to see that, to think about the fact that he's really gotten that taken care of, otherwise he'd be in real bad shape.
Absolutely. I think you bring up a good point too. That was actually going to be another case study that I was going to make up. I was going to be like, Jim Bro, who typically lifts and goes through this period. I don't know if they maybe do this, but there's this like weird culture in lifting to try to get your muscular physique to like show physically. And people do this thing called bulking and cutting, which is essentially eating a lot of nutrients daily in a period of time, and then cutting is exactly what it sounds like, restricting. Arguably, that sounds a lot like restricting to me. You're probably not getting enough nutrients during those times, and it's all for this to show off your physique, right? So lifting and this gym culture, especially around men too, I think those people are often very much underdiagnosed with disordered eating and eating disorders.
I'm curious, it may be too individualized, but any insights you would have for folks to be a positive influence if when there's a really resistive situation?
That's a good question. I'd probably go with our basic building blocks of meeting that person where they're at, meeting them with empathy. You don't have to understand necessarily what the blockage is, but to see somebody like, oh, I can really see you're struggling. That must be really hard. And meeting them there, and then say, hey, is there anything that I can do to make the situation easier for you, to help you tolerate this distress? Sometimes that means helping somebody take some deep breaths, right? Squeezing their hand, doing some kind of more somatic, like calm down, to help them kind of move through the trigger that they're probably experiencing. That would be my basic answer for that. Hopefully that's helpful. Any other thoughts, questions?
Just a comment, I remember I'm a recovering alcoholic for decades. In early recovery, someone was telling me, who was also in early recovery and had an eating disorder, you've got it so simple. You just can stop. I can't stop eating.
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up, because I also have some clients who have struggled with substance use and eating disorders, and they're like, with substance use, I can use abstinence.
Right.
I can just completely not have any substances, and that works for me, and it's easy to be sober in that way.
Right.
But we can't be sober. We have to eat every single day, if not 3 to 6 times a day. And oftentimes those people are hitting triggers every time they have a meal. So I'd say eating disorders are really sticky in that way, because there's a big feedback loop, because they consistently are faced with triggers daily.
I worked with swallowing disorders for adults, and I realized over time, and it wasn't part of the training or education, but a lot of people I was seeing, you know, had disordered eating, maybe a few eating disorders, but mostly disordered eating. And they would come in, you know, they can't swallow. It's almost like the Matthew example, you know, panic with choking and all of this, and we do the fancy swallow studies with barium and can show them the results to say, this looks very good, you know, and doing a variety of textures and having them bring in food so that we could problem solve. But toward the end of my practice, we were able to get with the Department of Gastroenterology, who was referring people, who also had a psychologist. So specific to that type of issue because while I have a background a minor in psychology, I am not, as you said, I'm well-intentioned, but I don't have a background in disordered eating. And so it was hard because people would leave feeling very upset that we didn't find what was wrong, when in fact, some of them you could tell based on the description of their history, it was trauma-related, many other things. So it was tricky, but I was so grateful when GI finally came up with an adjunct program. Hard to get in.
Totally.
The resources are so.
Thank you for sharing that. That is a tricky part of this, I think. Like our clients who went to their PCP after having certain symptoms, it's complicated, right? It could be so many different factors affecting how people's symptoms are showing up and really what are the roots of what's going on. And it takes a long time sometimes to figure that out. It takes a few specialists sometimes. It takes a referral to psychology sometimes. But that's doing good, complex, holistic work.
I just have a couple random observations. Just to piggyback on your response to Jean, you've referenced it several times, but in terms of kind of finding the resources, our limited experience with it is absolutely that team that includes the medical, the therapist, and the dietitian piece of it, and there's usually a psychiatrist for the med portion of it. The other thing, just from our experience with it, we found just having some mantras to be really helpful for them as well as for a family member of, and in the circumstances that we're most familiar with, there's probably some OCD and definitely anxiety disorders. So in some, I read quite a bit, I'm sorry for my rambling, but perfectionism thread can be a piece in a lot of this, and that's sometimes where some of this self-worth issue stems from. If I have this really high goal for myself, it's really tough if you're always falling short of perfection. So it was, you are loved and you are of great value.
I so appreciate that. I think that's really beautiful and connects to kind of what we learned about trauma too, is anytime somebody develops trauma, it's probably left out, but it's complicated, so you often internalize a negative belief about self anytime somebody has a traumatic experience. And sometimes that negative belief about self is, I see this a lot with my eating disorder clients that I do trauma work with, is I have to be perfect or I failed. And that part of the brain, it's a really black and white thought, right? It doesn't fully represent our complex, logical brain that thinks in a really broad perspective and can think really critically. But that's because it's associated with trauma, right? And oftentimes happens when reflection of age. Like kids have a very egocentric brain. What I mean by that is they see cause and effect as like they are the cause, they are the effect. That's just what their brain structures are primed for. And so that's a really important age for them. I mean, like thinking from like even really, really early on, like 3 to 18 and up, they have not a fully developed brain and they can be internalizing situations that are far more complex than that negative internalized belief about self. But they internalize it because that's where their brain structures are. And that creates like this channel usually in the brain, in the trauma brain, and there's like different triggers and memories associated on that channel. It's organized by negative belief about self. And so I love that you have those mantras because that really pokes a hole in that negative belief about self, right? And you don't have to be perfect. You're loved and you're trying your hardest, and all those things can really help because when they hit those trauma triggers, the negative beliefs about self usually kind of bubble up into their brain, and they have a really hard time seeing past them. So, long-winded answer there. But I really appreciate you bringing that up. That can be really helpful.
I just have a question. It's probably might be off the point too, but foods that cause inflammation in the body. So when I was seeing some of those charts up there, you were saying if you restrict these things, carbohydrates is one of the things especially that can cause inflammation. So is there a test or something that a person takes to find out what causes inflammation in your body? I just was curious about
That's
that.
a great question. I'm not the expert here, and I have run into quite a few of my clients going to like more holistic doctors and trying to assess for inflammation and trying to run tests or trying to eliminate certain food groups for a certain period of time and see how they feel. Inflammation is a tricky one.
Right.
Because we don't know exactly what's going on.
I think
Again, not the doctor,
different.
not the dietitian, but it could be there's an allergy and there's this like histamine response to a certain food. It could mean there's an intolerance, but it could also be connected to disordered eating, in which like in our first case, there's painful cramping and painful bloating. Some doctors might be like, oh, do you have a gluten intolerance? Is that what's going on here? Is that causing the inflammation?
Mm-hmm.
But there actually might just be muscle atrophy happening in that system. The gut and brain axis too is a big player here. So if your gut biome is thrown off, it can almost hijack the nerve that affects the signaling of these different nervous system states. So if we're going into fight or flight or freeze, our digestive tract shuts down because it's not necessary during that big survival mode. So that can affect this gut biome and connection to the brain. It's really complicated. It's my answer here.
Right, that's what I'm
I don't
thinking.
know,
Yeah,
right?
Like
Like,
you
there's
stop eating
so many factors.
to make sure that you get what you're supposed
Exactly.
to eat, but you can't have this,
Right,
and
right.
then you start restricting, and
Right.
then you go, then you really want it, well,
Right.
maybe I'm gonna eat it, and yeah,
Right.
it's a problem.
Right. And restricting can certainly throw off, like if we stop eating a full food group or a full macronutrient, our gut biome is going to be absolutely thrown off because it's not processing that same food and not creating, those bacteria. The healthy balance of bacteria is just not going to get it's food essentially, and so it can get really thrown off. And that is a big piece of this that I'm not the expert in, and could be something to consider when it comes to inflammation. I feel like you were going to say something.
Thanks.
Well, thank you.
All right.
Thank you
Yeah.
for listening.
Yeah.
Thank you to all our readers as well.
It's just so satisfying to have someone from who's a youth group alum come back and share what you're doing in the world. So we appreciate that.
Yes.
Yeah. So, yeah. So if y'all don't mind, I'll say a prayer. Yeah. Holy One, we thank you for Hannah sharing her wisdom and experience today, and we hope it makes us more compassionate people. Help us to let our little light shine in the world without bringing shame or hard feelings. In the company of Christ, I pray. Amen.
Thank you, Hannah.
Bye.
Bye, Mara. Bye, Jean.